Hello again, students. In this lecture, we will meet the early church father Tertullian and see why we value him, in spite of some idiosyncrasies, why he holds so much value for us as we study the beginnings of New Testament Christianity. Medieval manuscripts give his full name as Q. Septimius Florens Tertullianus. Q. Septimius Florens Tertullianus. Better to call him Tertullian. Much, much easier. And of his life, there's little is known. A traditional picture can be found here in Jerome, another church for the writings of another church father we will meet a little bit later in the context of Augustine. He writes, Tertullian, the next Latin writer after Victor and Apollonius, was a priest, a man of the province of Africa and the city of Carthage, and the son of a centurio proconsularis, a proconsul of a city. He possessed a sharp and violent talent, and flourished in the reigns of Severus and Caracalla. He wrote many volumes, which I shall omit because they are well known. I myself saw a certain Paul, and an old man of Concordia, which is a town in Italy. He told me that as a youth he had seen a man at Rome, who had been the secretary of the aged Cyprian, and who had recalled that Cyprian would never let a day pass without reading Tertullian, and that he often said to him, "Give me my master," clearly meaning Tertullian. So Cyprian read Tertullian daily. Then we need to know more about Tertullian. In this traditional view, Tertullian was born around 150 to 160, somewhere in between there, 150 to 160 AD, with a father being a centurion. He was converted in his 40s and died somewhere between 225 and 240 AD. But in my opinion, this view has been successfully challenged by T.D. Barnes, who teaches in the University of Toronto Department of Classics with a friend of mine named Michael Haken, who wrote one of our textbooks for this class. Barnes argues that Jerome's account is quite unreliable. What we do know must be gleaned from his writings, which appear to span a period of hardly more than 15 years, 196/97 to 212 AD, somewhere in there. We know for sure from these writings, what we know is the following. Tertullian appears to have been raised a pagan, and, as he wrote, on some occasions he sinned egregiously, shockingly. One thing I ask, that when you pray you may remember Tertullian a sinner. We also know that his Christian writings reveal a good literary education. He was a good writer. He appears to have frequented the amphitheater. He describes himself as a great sinner. Be mindful of Tertullian, the great sinner, of his on baptism book. That's how he concludes it, the last sentence. Be mindful of Tertullian, the sinner. When he was converted, we don't know really the age, beyond the fact that he was a mature adult. Circumstances not really known about that, so we won't speculate. He married a Christian wife, who very possibly died early in his marriage. On marriage, he wrote in a letter called To His Wife, "What kind of yoke is between two believers who share one hope, one desire, one discipline, one and the same service? Both are brethren, both fellow servants, with no difference of spirit or of flesh. Nay, they are truly two in one flesh. Together they pray, together prostrate themselves, together perform their fasts, mutually teaching, mutually exhorting, mutually sustaining. They are both equally found in the church of God, equally at the banquet of God, equally in straits, in persecutions, in refreshments. Neither hides anything from the other, neither shuns the other, neither is troublesome to the other. The sick is visited, the indigent relieved with freedom. Alms are given without danger of ensuing problems. Sacrifices attend without scruple. Daily duty discharged without impediment. There is no stealthy singing, no trembling, greeting, no mute benediction. Between the two echo psalms and hymns, and they mutually challenge each other as to who shall better chant to their Lord. Such things Christ rejoices in when he sees and hears them. To these he gives his peace. And so Tertullian wrote. And one of the odd things about his life and his testimony is that in the year 206 or 207, he became a Montanist. And we'll see what that is here in a moment. Kind of a theologically questionable group in the early church who were a little bit like early charismatics, only with theology not quite as good. But the reason he joined the Montanists, Tertullian was very interested in ethical questions, dealing with such things as martyrdom. He kind of obsessed with martyrdom, as some were in these days. It was a good way to get your name in the paper back in those days, to become a martyr for Christ. He was interested in remarriage after the death of one spouse, which is why we think maybe his spouse died. The veiling of virgins, something that interested him, oddly enough. By the time Tertullian encountered Montanism, it had probably changed somewhat from its early origins. It is extremely doubtful whether Tertullian ever met a Montanist in the flesh, an old school Montanist. His first contact with them was probably through their writings. Impulse toward Montanism may have resulted from the death of his wife, one scholar argues. So what did Montanism promote? Well, among other things, the movement believed in the possibility of fresh words from God. The brother, I have a word, and the words from God, and this is the word. And I don't know if it was like some of the modern charismatics who say someone in here has cancer, and we're going to heal them tonight. I have no idea, but it's a fresh word from God. They also glorified martyrdom. In a book on flight in time of persecution, one of them wrote, "If you ask counsel of the Spirit, what does he approve more than that utterance of the Spirit? For indeed, he incites almost to go and offer themselves in martyrdom, not to flee from it." It's invited martyrdom. They also denied the possibility of forgiveness after such sins as apostasy, adultery, fornication. So those are the big ticket items. On purity, they wrote, "The Paraclete himself says in the person of the new prophets, the church can forgive sins, but I will not lest others sin." So they were afraid of too much grace, lest we sin so we receive grace. They also denied the possibility of remarriage after the death of one's spouse, and Tertullian wrote that on monogamy. After 220, nothing is known about Tertullian. A scholar, Dr. Barnes, which we heard earlier, believes that he may have died a martyr. According to Augustine, he founded his own sect, the Tertullianists, whom Augustine managed to persuade to rejoin the church. He is known to have written 43 books, of which we possess 31. His literary corpus may be divided into three general groupings. One, apologetic works responding to a persecuting empire, such as his To the Nations, Apology, and To Scapula. Two, treatises he wrote on doctrinal matters that seek to refute heresy, in particular Gnosticism. Thus he wrote against Marcion. But also modalism, which was a Trinitarian heresy that seems to have had a wide following in North Africa, when he wrote a book called Against Praxeas. Disciplinary works that focus on the duties that flow out of faith, thus on baptism, on the dress of women. I think I heard that one once when I was a kid in church. So what debt do we owe to Tertullian? Well, mainly it's his being the first teacher to formulate the doctrine of the Trinity among Latin-speaking Christians. Of his Trinitarian theology, B.B. Warfield has written, the great Reformed theologian, wrote, "If Tertullian may not be credited with the invention of the doctrine of the Trinity, it may yet be that it was through him that the elements of this doctrine first obtained something like a scientific adjustment." So Warfield described him as the father of the church doctrine of the Trinity. In fact, it's been asserted that Tertullian's development of his theology of the Trinity was rooted in Montanism. We're not sure. To him we owe a great part of the Christian Latin vocabulary. For example, the pertaining to the Trinity. Persona, which is the persons of the Godhead. Substantia, the substance of the Godhead, the persons of the Godhead. And spiritualitas, those terms which pertain to the Trinity. He coined such phrases as the blood of the martyrs is the seed that watered the early church, waters the church. What has Athens got to do with Jerusalem? Tertullian's involvement in Montanism made his theological corpus suspect in the eyes of later North African theologians, however. Cyprian never names him, though, as the anecdote quoted from Jerome indicates, we quoted earlier, he was a constant presence in Cyprian's writings. Augustine can note that Tertullian was a penetrating author, but he does not hesitate to describe him as a heretic in Augustine's book on heresies. He does not include him among those who deemed important Christian authors. Yet, in many ways, Tertullian anticipated Augustine in a number of areas, most particularly apologetics. In this regard, we see this in Augustine's On the City of God, one of his most famous works of the legacy of North African Christianity and apologetics, in a Trinitarian theology, which Augustine admitted he owed a debt to Tertullian in his work in Augustine's famous and well quoted work on the Trinity. It is, after all, Tertullian who coined the word Trinitas, Trinity, and who devises the description of the Trinity as tres personae, three persons, una substantiae, one substance. Three persons, one substance. The orthodox view of the Trinity. And Tertullian's development of our understanding of the doctrine of the Trinity is the main reason why. In spite of his obvious theological quirkiness in joining the Montanists, we are indebted to him and count him as important, vital among the early church fathers.